Hello, this Mysticode video on the high qualities of Sony Pictures was sponsored by Chris over on Patreon. If you want to throw your support and possibly suggest some video ideas of your own, guaranteeing that spot on the schedule, just visit my Patreon. Link is in the description. And now, on with the show. There's an odd cyclical event that often happens within the film fandom, and that's the strange vile hatred some hold for a specific major Hollywood studio. A few years back, 20th Century Fox was the studio people hated. There was a period when Warner Brothers was seen as a laughingstock. Even Disney, who everyone now loves and attend massive conventions in celebration of, was once considered a studio whose only quality pictures came from the house of John Lasseter. And now, for some reason, it's Sony Pictures, the pairing of Columbia and TriStar Pictures, that everyone likes to pile on. Not me. I like all of the major studios, and I think Sony deserves more recognition than they are currently getting. They do not deserve the sass and snide remarks. But before I get into my defense, let me provide a brief history. Columbia Pictures was founded by Joe Brandt and brothers Jack and Harry Cohn in 1918 as a distribution company, primarily of short subjects. Through the 1920s and 30s, the Cohns grew their library of films at an affordable price, with a lot of the credit for that rise going to Frank Capra, who directed feel-good and heartwarming comedies that were exactly what people needed during the Great Depression. Columbia also made stars out of the Three Stooges and distributed Walt Disney's early Mickey Mouse and Silly Symphonies cartoons. While Columbia did not have the large stable of stars that famously filled MGM and Warner Brothers lots, the studio still had a good eye for talent. They also found a niche not only with comedies but also westerns. In the 1950s and 1960s, Columbia found themselves producing groundbreaking films on topical subjects, most notably with On the Waterfront and Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove. They also had a good relationship with David Lean, producing his Oscar-winning classics Bridge on the River Kwai and Lawrence of Arabia. The 1970s was a low point for Columbia, and they would have gone bankrupt had it not been for Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It was an expensive film Columbia was not sure they could afford when the production went over budget. But it was successful enough to keep Columbia going for many years to come, and leading to a period of hits in the 1980s, particularly Ghostbusters and The Karate Kid. That's right, if it weren't for Spielberg, those films would not exist, and Columbia would not be around today. In 1982, TriStar Pictures was established, although its slate was not a specifically defined one, though it tended to favor prestige pictures, silly comedies, and fantasy films. After the Japanese electronics company Sony bought Columbia, they merged the two studios and created Sony Pictures Entertainment, and that's why they tend to be referred to by their parent company. Within SPE, there are multiple labels, which I will defend today, all of which contribute something specific to the studio at large. Columbia Pictures is, of course, the central one. There is an emphasis on tentpoles, but they will also produce comedies, animated films, and even prestigious projects by noted directors. Of their tentpoles, the most successful franchise has been SpiderMan. Their treatment of SpiderMan over the years has garnered the most harsh reaction from fanboys, but as their biggest film property, one cannot blame the studio for being protective of it. I don't think Sony gets nearly enough credit for deciding to team up with Disney's Marvel Studios to produce this summer's Spider-Man Homecoming. While it got a mixed reception, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 still made plenty of money, and Sony could have easily continued to make more of them. The admittance to accept that audiences were growing weary of the web crawler and to let another studio entirely handle the creative reins took a lot to accomplish. Do you know how rare that is to see two major studios teaming up on a franchise, especially their biggest franchise? It's not common, and they even let Marvel have total creative freedom to do what they wanted, despite Sony footing a lot of the bill. Of course, it's not just big, expensive superhero pictures that Sony has found a name for themselves with. They played a role in revitalizing the James Bond brand, teaming up with MGM and Eon Productions to take 007 in a new direction with Casino Royale, and they had a solid partnership through 4 films. Sony's animation division has had solid growth over the years, with Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs being a particular game changer for a couple of reasons. First, hiring Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, who at that point were only for hire screenwriters with a cancelled MTV cartoon to their name, and giving them the push to make a wacky, out-there comedic disaster movie. Without Sony head Amy Pascal taking a chance on these two, we would not be getting the wonderfully created Lego movies over at Warner Brothers. Cloudy also showed a new way of using computer animation to really take the medium in new directions beyond the almost photorealistic look common in such productions by applying a more cartoony aesthetic. Their partnership with Aardman also produced a couple of strong films. Notably, Pirates Band Misfits was originally going to be computer animated, but looking at some of the early development models they built, Sony insisted Aardman make it in their traditional stop-motion technique. And need I mention Sausage Party? Every other studio in town scoffed the idea of doing an R-rated animated film that parodied Pixar and the religion versus atheism debate. But Sony said, "We'll do it." I'll always admire the cojones Sony executives had in making that film possible. And while Warner Brothers is handling the domestic release of Blade Runner 2049, Sony actually provided a good chunk of the budget, so it's technically more of a Sony production than it is a Warner one. Now, with the recent release of Flatliners, I know what some people are thinking. Oh, Sony just cares about regurgitating that old IP. That is people's chief complaint about the studio, that they're so obsessed with chasing money, they feel the need to make a new version of Ghostbusters and a Jumanji sequel. And you know what? You're right. I mean, that big screen version of the Chips television series? Who wanted that? No, wait, that one was Warner Brothers. Well, Baywatch. Boy, was that pointless. And also Paramount. Well, why does Sony keep making Alien movies? Just let the franchise rest in peace. Sorry, my mistake. 20th Century Fox is behind that property. Well, did you see that they had the gall to make a live-action version of the Best Picture-nominated animated classic Beauty and the Beast? What am I talking about? That was Disney. I just had an epiphany. Every studio dips into the library and greenlights films based on old IP. Silly me, everyone keeps saying Sony is the only one obsessed with doing that. Beyond their franchise projects, Sony also has been committed to continue making prestigious films with noted directors, putting their support behind the likes of The Social Network and Captain Phillips in recent years. And with a lot of talk lately about the need for more women directors in Hollywood, Sony understands that and is currently developing and producing upcoming projects directed by Elizabeth Banks, Michelle MacLaren, Alethea Jones, and Gina Prince Bythewood, among others. Meanwhile, under the guidance of Tom Rothman, TriStar Pictures has managed to find a purpose after many decades of uncertainty, as it's now become the home for director-driven passion projects by celebrity auteurs. Who gave Edgar Wright $35 million to make an original heist film with an offbeat musical sensibility? TriStar. Who gave Danny Boyle $18 million so he could finally make his long-awaited sequel to Trainspotting? TriStar. Who gave Ang Lee $40 million so he could direct an Iraq War satire in the highest frame rate possible, a project that sounds otherwise uncommercial, but they trusted him anyway? You guessed it, TriStar. Even Ridley Scott has taken a brief break from directing films at his usual home at Fox to make the John Paul Getty kidnapping drama All the Money in the World at TriStar. Screen Gems is another Sony division that went through many periods of not quite knowing its role in the company, but is now known for releasing the studio's horror films as well as movies aimed at an African-American audience. Quite a few of your favorite recent horror movies have probably been released by Screen Gems, and that Taraji P. Henson action movie opening next year that looks like a fun homage to 70s blaxploitation cinema, that's a Screen Gems release. One Sony unit that has remained consistent with its mission statement since being launched in 1992 is Sony Pictures Classics, enough that founders Michael Barker and Tom Bernard are still running the studio today. Sony Classics has been committed to releasing independent films, and Sony Pictures has given them complete control to release whatever film they desire at a reasonable price. Even as Warner Brothers led their indie division Shudder and Disney sold Miramax off, SVC is still a major part of the studio, and unlike Focus and Fox Searchlight, they're still releasing foreign films, making a point of acquiring some of the best in the world. They've even helped give more attention to experimental and adult foreign animated films like The Triplets of Belleville, The Illusionist, Persepolis, and The Red Turtle. It is true that a couple of years ago, Sony Pictures was not in the best position, as they experienced a fair share of expensive bombs. However, that has allowed Sony to reinvent itself by becoming smarter with their budgets and not overspending when they don't need to. There was a bit of that last year, as I felt Ghostbusters and The Magnificent Seven were both overpriced as comedies and westerns, always a risk with overseas markets. However, this year all of their films have been reasonably budgeted, and Sony has also understood the value of their international audience and not solely focusing on what an American audience might like. It's often been said how mid-budget films are becoming less common in Hollywood, but Sony has now become the studio of mid-budget films, with only 2 or 3 big-budget tentpoles a year. This year, their only mega-expensive movies have been SpiderMan Homecoming and the upcoming Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle, which are films that would require a large budget. Everything else has been on the low to mid-budget range. That's why the Columbia and TriStar slates are filled with original and slightly more risky projects at the moment. Yes, they greenlit the Emoji Movie. However, they could have got really stupid with that and spent a ridiculous amount for a film about talking smiley faces. Nope, just $50 million. While on the subject of the Emoji Movie, it's crazy the negative response the announcement and subsequent film got. Because, you know, Sony is the first studio to ever greenlight a stupid movie based on a current trend. Never happened before in the history of cinema. Space Jam? Pfft, that never happened. The Garbage Pail Kids movie? I think people have been making that up. Nope, the Emoji Movie was the very first of its kind. However, what was the root for the sunburst of Sony hate? I think it all boils down to a little incident known as the Sony email hack. Remember when that happened, when the Seth Rogen comedy The Interview caused Sony Pictures servers to be hacked and emails and other information was leaked out? What was the main thing people focused on? It wasn't this illegal breach of personal information. It wasn't that employees' social security numbers were available online. It was not even that a couple of high-profile, yet-to-be-released films were unleashed online. It was the email exchanges between film executives, producers, and others involved in the production of Sony projects. Suddenly, people started tweeting and linking and digging into these WikiLeaked emails with utter glee, like they were leafing through the gossip papers at supermarket checkouts. And I frankly found that behavior to be rather despicable. These weren't the Pentagon Papers. They weren't documents released by an internal source to protect the populace. These were stolen private materials and emails, and people were gobbling them up, not realizing what was going on inside the walls in Culver City. What was in these emails anyway? Probably backs and forths that were not that different than email conversations that go on at other studios. It did not make me respect those folks reading them. I instead respected the likes of George Clooney, Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, and Aaron Sorkin even more for calling out those who did read those emails with delight. And it gave me even more sympathy for the people working at Sony Pictures, including former head Amy Pascal. Moving beyond that, I do like plenty of the films Sony releases. Do they have a perfect batting average? No, no studio does. But I will have a degree of anticipation for the films they greenlight, whether it's the next Spider-Man movie, or one of their highly creative animated spectacles, or a $30 million film from a director whose work I like. Whenever I see that Sony logo pop up on screen, followed by the Columbia Lady, TriStar Pegasus, or glowing Screen Gems S, I look forward to what will follow. Thank you for the many great films you've produced, Sony Pictures Entertainment, and I'm sure you'll make many more in the future. See you next time.